Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming to our regular well-being seminars. I am really excited that we have a fantastic speaker today. Dr. Robert Waldinger is a Zen priest as well as a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and he is the director of the Harvard Study on Adult Development, which is the longest ever sort of running study of adult life and happiness, and he will tell us more about that today. In his writings, he talks about how both Zen and science can teach us a lot about adult development and happiness. So, welcome.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to stand because I understand that the videotape is going to lose me if I sit down. So here I am. I have a tie on, and I'm standing up, and none of you wears a tie, you know. And actually, you can tell the only other person from my research group is Mike Navarez, because he has a tie. It's not because we're from Harvard, it's because we're from MGH. So doctors tend to dress up for patients. We were all taught it was a sign of respect, so that's why we run around with these archaic things. Anyway, I'm really pleased to be here. It was really great that Adam invited me, and this was so I gave a TED talk, and you'll hear, I mean, some of this is related to the talk that I gave, but my first rehearsal for that TED talk was in this room. John Warner, who runs the local TED event, sort of got everybody together. So and I was incredibly nervous. So I actually it's much nicer to be here now than it was that first time. So all right. So I'm going to give you. The other thing that's a little scary is being with so many scientists and coming and giving you really a bird's eye view of this 80-year-long study. So I'm not going to be getting down into the scientific weeds, but we can take you there if you need to go there. But I just want you to know that this will be more of an overview of what we've done and really just snippets of what the study does, because the study has generated hundreds of papers and books and all kinds of things. The other thing is that the TED organization billed our study as a study of happiness. It's not a study of happiness. It's a study of adult development. But happiness sells, so that's why we got billed that way. So I'm going to talk about well-being because we think a lot about that, and that's what you're all thinking about, I know. So, but happiness per se is not the primary focus of what we do. Now, let me see if I can get Adam's computer. Yeah, okay. So first, you probably know now that there's a lot more interest in happiness than there used to be. That 20 years ago, the king of Bhutan said, we shouldn't just measure gross national product, we should measure gross national happiness. And they actually do that. But then people began to take it much more seriously, that the idea had been for decades that gross domestic product was not just an indicator of economic activity, that it was an indicator of how happy people were. And what we came to understand was that that was woefully inadequate. That was a complete misrepresentation of whether populations felt that they were thriving. And so the UN has begun to do very good, solid research on this with demographers, sociologists, a lot of people involved in teams that every year put out a happiness report. And what they do is go through, they ask people, first of all, what are the things that contribute to your sense of having a decent life? And then how much does your current environment afford you that sense? So what we've learned is that it's not just GDP. And of course, there's a certain basic level of economic well-being that we know is important. And actually, there was one study in the US that suggested several years ago that kind of below $75,000 a year for a household income made for much less well-being. So understandably, economic well-being has to be the baseline. But then what we understand over and above that is that there's so many other factors that make a difference, and those include the sense of social support, a sense of whether you can expect to live a healthy life, whether you feel you have the freedom to make your own life choices, which, as you can imagine, in different parts of the world varies tremendously. Generosity, actually the capacity, the opportunity to be generous, not just financially generous, but generous with your time and your energy, turns out to be a factor that contributes to happiness. So the Buddhists actually had it right all the way along. And trust, essentially the absence of corruption, whether you can trust, and not just your government, but whether you can trust your neighbors. And as you know, that varies tremendously around the world. So if we've come to know that these are some of the pillars of well-being for populations across the world, what happens when we ask people what they want, young people? And this was what I sort of set up in my TED Talk, that the Pew organization did a study several years ago where they asked young millennials basically what their most important life goals were, and over 80% said that their biggest life goal was not just to get enough income to be okay, but to get rich. And over half of the same group of people said that a second major life goal was to become famous, which is really interesting if you think about it. Why would you want to have lots of people know your name who have no connection with you? So fame is itself a very bizarre construct, but one that people seem to yearn for. And then a lot of people also talked in that same survey about really throwing themselves into work. And sort of it was a time when Lean In came out, and, you know. And so the question is, what is responsible for this disconnect? And I don't think anyone knows, but there are some major culprits and ones that we're actually interested in looking into more and more with our younger generations. And I'll tell you more about that. But one idea is that essentially people's idea about what constitutes a good life is really shaped for us by a whole variety of influences, much of them media. But by media, I mean everything, you know, billboards, advertisements in magazines, just all across the board, every message that we get on the internet. So that if you think about it, think about all the images you see, we are bombarded every day by images that suggest to us what life is supposed to be like for people. And subliminally, it's shaping our expectations. That's at least what I would argue. And so, you know, so I'm interested in this, like this is an image from Facebook, right? And it's not a surprise, right? This is the kind of stuff we post on Facebook. Imagine you were a person coming from another planet and you wanted to find out what human life was like, and your only source was Facebook. You would think that we were either at a party or on vacation all the time, that that's what human beings did, because that's what we post. Now, what effect does that have on all of us? And whether you use Facebook or not, you are a media consumer of one sort or another, so you're getting images like this. And the problem, I would argue, is that it gives the impression, at least subliminally, that we're missing out, that life is supposed to be like this, because that's what everybody's putting out there. And one of my Zen teachers said this that I just love, that we're always comparing our insides to other people's outsides. That we're always comparing what we know about our inner life, which is messy and unpredictable and up and down and full of, you know, joy and unhappiness and loneliness and confusion and all that stuff, right? But when we look at not just what people post on Facebook, for example, but the game faces that we try to put on for each other every day, we don't lead with that by and large. And it's probably for the best that we don't, but it can leave us all with the impression that real life is not what I'm having, right? And that, I think, may be responsible for some of this disconnect that we see between what people aspire to and what we know actually gives people a sense of well-being. And just one more point about this. Think about the way we are told our bodies are supposed to look. And I'm deliberately using a male body here because, and female bodies are so much more exploited in the media. But think about subliminally what that says about what we're supposed to look like. If you're a real man or a real woman. You know, when was the last time we ever got shown this ad, right? You know, but all of this creates a certain sense of missing out, of I'm not the right thing, I don't have the right stuff. And I think that that's part of what we're up against when we try to look at this problem of what are our expectations for a meaningful life, and then how do we fulfill those expectations? Okay, there we go. So now, how do we learn about life? Well, so we do this thing, Mike and I do this thing called lifespan development, where we follow people over long periods of time. But most of what we know about life, we know from asking people to remember the past. Probably about 98% of what we know. And asking people to remember the past is a perfectly valid way, one way of understanding what has happened to people in their lives. But we know that memory is quite, it's unreliable. That, Dan Schachter wrote that great book, The 7 Sins of Memory, and that there are quite a number of systematic distortions that our memories involve us in. So I'll just talk about 3 of them. One is the recency effect. So, for example, I had a great vacation, but on the last day I had a terrible fight with my wife. And I'm going to more likely remember that vacation as being about the fight with my wife because it was the most recent thing that happened. And they're good experiments that talk about this systematic distortion that all of our minds do. Similarly, emotional salience. So it might be that I had that terrible argument with my wife on the second day, but because it was the emotionally most salient event, it might still become the story I tell myself about that week away. And finally, suggestibility. One of the things we know is that, if I say that you're wearing a black shirt with white polka dots, but everybody else tells me, oh no, it's really navy blue, and everybody kind of reminds me of it, we all leave, but you all remind me that it was really navy blue, I very likely will come to remember it as navy blue. And as you can imagine, in courts of law, eyewitness testimony is very problematic for this reason. Because what happens is that our memories get shaped, and we literally have different visual and auditory memories, as well as cognitive memories, depending on the stories we retell and the stories other people tell us. You could probably think about this because you probably have some early memories from your childhood, and you're not sure whether you actually remember it or people told you that it happened. That's the kind of thing we're talking about, but it happens all the time. So that's one of the reasons why just relying for a picture of human life on what we remember leaves us with lots of holes and some distortions. The second reason is that very often what investigators do is they will take snapshots of people across the lifespan. So they might look at a group of 20-year-olds and a group of 30-year-olds and a group of 50-year-olds and so on, and say, okay, we know how life progresses because we can look right now, in December of 2017 at this phenomenon as it shows up in different age groups. But that implies continuities that don't necessarily exist. So the best quote about this I've ever heard was from Claude Pepper, who used to be a senator from the state of Florida, and he was talking about southern Florida and what a strange population there is in South Florida. And he said, when I look at South Florida, I would have to believe that you're born Cuban and you die Jewish. Because essentially, these are assumptions about continuity that don't necessarily exist, and that it can fool investigators in terms of, so this is all my way of saying that the fact that Mike and I follow this group of people and that I'm the fourth director of this study and that we've done this for 80 years is worth something, but it's very hard to do. So the longitudinal research is really difficult to do. It involves, it's kind of the ultimate in deferred gratification and messiness, and as you can imagine, we are sort of a history of research methods, which I'll tell you more about later. So this study that we've done began in 1938. And as far as we know, it's the longest study of any depth that has been going continuously with the same individuals. So groups of individuals were followed from adolescence in 1938 all the way till the present. Most of them have died. The few men who are still living are in their 90s. But most longitudinal studies collapse before too much time elapses, before too many years elapse, because too many people drop out. So scientifically, it's just not tenable to keep following groups because your dropouts are lost to you, and so you don't know about systematic biases. This group was unusual in that it consisted of two groups, one of Harvard undergrads and one of inner city Boston boys, and I'll tell you more about those. But the attrition rate for the Harvard undergrads was only 5%. Some people would drop in and out of the study, but only 5% dropped out permanently. And the inner city men, only 22% dropped out. So a good retention rate is like 40% dropout rate. So this was unusual, and it was largely thanks to my predecessors and their kind of doggedness and skill at maintaining a sense of community among these people. So, so the Harvard men were all Harvard College sophomores from the classes of 1939 to 1942. And they were selected by their deans for being among the most sturdy and healthy and sound young men. Whatever that meant, in 1939. And so they were recruited into the study, and all of them, of course, are white male from Harvard, because they wanted to study normal young adult development. So at that time, if you wanted to study normal young adult development, you studied all white men from Harvard. I mean, it's the most politically incorrect sample you could ever have, and we're constantly having to explain to the federal government why it's still worth funding us. The second cohort that was also gathered at the same time in 1938 was a group of inner city Boston boys who came from particularly disadvantaged and troubled families known on average to like 5 social service agencies. And because this was part of a study at Harvard Law School of why some kids became juvenile delinquents who were from terrible homes, and other kids managed to stay out of trouble. So my predecessor, George Valiant, in the 70s had the foresight to say, we should put these two samples together. And so he began to follow these two groups together and ask similar questions of both groups as a way of looking at people who started out very differently in life, and comparison groups. Still all white males, but we're getting better. And I'll tell you, we're getting better still in the second generation. So when these young men came into the study, they were all given extensive physical exams, psychiatric exams. Workers went to their homes and talked to their parents and made notes about everything, including how orderly the household was. And then all the Harvard men were of the generation to go to World War II. All but 6 of them, or 8 of them served in World War II. So you know the exact number, yeah. And the inner city men were on average 9 years younger, so they did not serve in the war. And but then they basically went into all walks of life, factory workers, doctors, lawyers. John F. Kennedy was one of the participants. Quite a number of people developed the diseases that people develop. So there were quite a number of alcoholics, some schizophrenics, people with varieties of chronic illness, but quite a lot of people just out there living their lives from both groups, from the Harvard group and the inner city group. And then we followed them into late life, into old age, and so we got more and more interested in aging and retirement. That's the inner city cohort. These are the neighborhoods of Boston where these young men came from. And then these are the kind of basic demographics of the group. And the social classes were very different. Household income in 1977, as you can see, was vastly different between the inner city group and the Harvard group. IQ was very different because the inner city group was selected deliberately to match a group of juvenile delinquents that had lower IQ. That said, many of the inner city men have done remarkably well, and so some of the lower IQ may have been artificial. So in adolescence, as I said, we did these extensive interviews and medical and psychiatric exams. And then over the next, 80 years, every 2 years, we asked them to fill out a questionnaire about their lives. With their permission, we got their medical records roughly every 5 years from their doctors. And then every 10 years, sometimes every 15 years, we would go to their homes and sit down and interview them about their lives. And so some of the repeated measures, many of the questions that were asked were just asked one time and then not asked again, which, as you can imagine, is hard when you look back, because you always wish you had done things differently looking back. But there were a lot of repeated measures of relationship status and satisfaction, social functioning, employment, exercise, physical health, mental health, and substance use. So those are kind of the big domains of life: health and work and social life and love life. And then when I came on in 2003, we brought in the wives who would play with us, and we did a study of late life marriage and health. And then in 2007, we began a project on the social neuroscience of aging, looking at relationship between social functioning and brain functioning, between well-being, happiness, and brain functioning. And then we began so we did neuro imaging, we drew blood for DNA, and as you can imagine, one of the things that's so interesting is that, in 1938, when this study began, no one knew what DNA was. No one had conceptualized DNA, certainly not neuro imaging. So we're adding new ways of understanding development and trying to measure some of the same constructs. And some of the men have donated their brains, which is and so what we will have is a small bank of brains where we know a great deal about what happened to these people in life. And that's unusual. Most brains are harvested because there's some particular pathological problem in life. So essentially, what are some of the big things we learned? Well, I gave a TED Talk about one big domain that was a surprise to us, which was our finding that the quality of people's relationships was a huge predictor of how they were going to grow old, both in terms of their emotional well-being. That wasn't such a surprise, but also their physical well-being. So I thought the biggest surprise for us was that bigger social networks, higher quality relationships, not only kept you happier, that seemed to go hand in hand, but also predicted that you would get the diseases of aging less soon, if at all. And so we're talking about diseases of aging in multiple systems: type 2 diabetes, heart disease, arthritis. And initially, my predecessors didn't believe these results and thought that they might be artifacts of the data. But what would happen, as you can imagine, is that other studies, other research groups began to find similar things. And then what we began to understand is that this mind-body connection that we often pay lip service to was turning out to be quite real in a lot of our data. So we began to learn a lot more about social connectedness and health, that in some studies, being more socially connected is as powerful a predictor of healthy aging as not smoking cigarettes, that high blood pressure is not as strong a predictor as loneliness of poor aging. Similarly, loneliness is worse than obesity in some studies. That we do find that there is a benefit to being partnered. I shouldn't have done all this. That married men and women live on average longer than those who are single. And doesn't mean having a marriage license. It means being in a partnership as you grow older. The benefit for men is greater than for women. But there's still, and when it comes to satisfaction, the discrepancy is even greater, that men are more satisfied being in romantic partnerships than women are. But we're not going to go there today. So broader social networks and more social activity predict this later onset, not only of physical decline, but cognitive decline. So that there have been some good studies out of the University of Chicago talking about slower rates of decline in cognition in terms of normal cognitive decline, but also onset of dementia and rate of decline in dementia.
Question?
Yeah.
I can imagine onset of disease causing social withdrawal. Did you have the temporal resolution to?
Yeah, that's a really, right. So which comes first? And that's one of the things we're always trying to figure out in this kind of study. So is it that social withdrawal is the result of cognitive decline? And so what we're able to do is some of that chicken and egg kind of analysis.
Other kinds of decline,
Yeah,
physical,
absolutely.
any
Similarly. And it does look as though it's bidirectional. So yes, people who have more physical problems can't go out as much, can't see people as much. So that is true. But there does seem to be a stronger effect in the other direction, predictive effect. So, because we can tell, the good thing about this longitudinal research is we know what came first. But it's a really important question. And then the other thing we're finding is that it's not just quality, it's not just the quantity of your relationship. So it's not just seeing more people in a given week, it's literally the quality. That, some studies have shown that people who have more negative, unpleasant interactions in a given week have earlier physical decline. Positive interactions seem to decrease the body's stress response and keep people healthy longer. And then we did a study where we had followed people all the way out into their 80s, and we wanted to see if we could predict from what we knew about them earlier on who was going to be healthy at age 80 and who wasn't. And that's where we went back to age 50 and looked at a whole bunch of things, thinking that it would be their cholesterol and their blood pressure. And it turned out that the most powerful predictor of who was going to be healthier, not just happier, at age 80 was their marital satisfaction. Almost all the men were married. And marital satisfaction was at age 50, was a very powerful predictor of age 80 health. Some really good work out of University of Chicago in particular, but lots of labs, and we've been doing more work on loneliness. Loneliness is different from social connectedness because loneliness is a subjective experience of not being as connected to other people as you want to be. So as you know, you can be lonely in a marriage, you can be lonely surrounded by all kinds of people, right? So, but loneliness turns out to predict earlier cognitive and physical decline. So one of the things we're asking about a lot now is the subjective experience of loneliness independent of people's social networks, people's marital status, that kind of thing. So one of the things we're always trying to look for is mechanisms. So this becomes a kind of black box. If relationship quality actually does predict health, why? How do relationships actually get under the skin and into the body? And our current project is all about this. We're basically working on a model of stress. And because what we know is that both stress and loneliness are associated with heightened cardiovascular reactivity, some other things too, decreased immune function, elevated stress hormones and chronic inflammation. And then I'm going to try to go quickly through this. So the other thing we get to do when we follow people over time is look at changes in this case, relationships over time. And this has been corroborated in other studies, that what we see is that, in terms of relationship satisfaction, our relationships are most satisfying when we get together, right? When we just start. And then relationship satisfaction takes a nosedive when the first child is born, often because it's a big stressor, and people have less time for each other because they're focused on child rearing. That relationship satisfaction tends to go back up when the kids leave home, and it only goes down again in the US if the kids come back to live at home. And but again, first of all, this is in the United States. In many cultures, patterns of children living at home aren't like this. And also, these are large groups of people. This is not any particular family, so this doesn't necessarily apply to your family life. One of the things we do know is that relationships don't have to be entirely smooth. There's a lot of good research, not just ours, but a lot of research showing that relationships don't have to be happy all the time. In fact, people can fight a lot. That's not necessarily a problem. That what the marital research seems to find, and certainly we've found, is that as long as there is a baseline of affection and secure connection, that arguments and anger in a relationship aren't the problem. It's the absence of affection and the absence of security of attachment that seem to be the most detrimental to people's health and well-being. I'm gonna move, okay, I'll go through this quickly. One of the things we know is that relationships get happier as people get older. That people have fewer conflicts, that conflict resolution it's a big developmental task when you're younger and you're in relationships, and it should be. But that as couples get older, when we tried to ask couples to have a little argument and videotape them as part of our study of older couples, they couldn't think of much to argue about. And because they would say, we used to argue about stuff like money, and we just know how it's going to come out. So anyway, let me see. And that, I'm not going to do this. But the only thing that we do notice, which we've studied some and other groups have studied more, is something called the positivity effect, which we understand as people get older, that we both attend to and remember positively valenced information more than negative as we get older. It's a shift that starts to happen around age 45 and continues throughout aging. And that's in contrast to younger adults who are really programmed to notice the negative and remember the negative far more. And you can think of all kinds of evolutionary reasons why paying attention to what's negative on the horizon might be adaptive. But there's a normative shift, and it's not about losing your marbles. That people who have all their marbles, and as they get older, notice this shift where they pay less attention to the negative and more to the positive. All right, so I'm just going to briefly tell you what we're doing now. First of all, we're able to archive all of the pieces of paper. So if you came to our lab, you would see like this one room that is just filled with file cabinets with hundreds of thousands of pieces of paper. And the paper is crumbling. So we got a grant to archive, to scan every page. And so now we have searchable PDFs, which has been wonderful. Because we find that there are things we didn't know we had. There were questions we didn't know were asked. Because you can imagine that each person's file is this thick. And so that's been a huge help to us in terms of the first generation. And then what we're doing now is a study of all the children. So all of the, this is obviously a photoshopped Michelangelo's David, and there's a caption that comes with this poster that says, Michelangelo returns from a 2-year tour of the United States. But anyway, so what you can tell is that we're studying midlife physical health, and obesity is one of the things we're interested in. But what we're doing is we're studying all the children, and most of the children are baby boomers. Most of the children are in their 50s and 60s. About 1,300 of those children have participated with us so far. And what we're trying to understand is how the quality of their childhoods relates to their midlife health. Because one of the things that many studies have begun to show is that people who have very difficult childhoods, unstable, abusive, stressful childhoods, have health that breaks down sooner in midlife. So what we're trying to understand is how that happens. And the reason why we're in a unique position to do this is that we have reports from the parents, more the fathers than the mothers, over many, many years of what their families were like. And then we have the baby boomer children's recollections as well, and we're going to get to compare those and also look at the relationship between what I remember about my childhood and my health, but also what my parents said about my childhood and my health. So does it matter more that you had a happy childhood or that you think you had a happy childhood for your midlife health? So that's part of what we're going to look at. So basically, and then I'm going to move quickly. Yeah. So
that's my computer. Apologies.
okay.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. All right. It's like a mindfulness bell. So our model basically for this study is, that we look at childhood adversity. We're looking at midlife emotion processing because our one idea is that essentially the way childhood adversity and stress break down your health is by setting up a chronic fight or flight response. Mm-hmm. That the fight or flight response, as you know, is adaptive, right? That we need those physiologic changes to run away from danger or to stand and fight. But that then when the stress is gone, we want the body to return to its pre-stressed physiologic states. So one theory for which there's a lot more support now is that people who have been traumatized, especially chronically traumatized, may be in a somewhat low-level continual fight or flight response that sets up all kinds of biological reactions that gradually wear the body down. And so that's part of what we're testing. One idea is that people who've had really difficult childhoods are left without such good equipment in terms of processing stress, processing negative emotions. So they're more likely perhaps to be impulsive, to see threat everywhere, to have more difficulty coping with stress in ways that don't harm them. So that's why there may be more obesity, more depression, more anxiety among people who have come from stressful childhoods. So let's see. So basically, what we're doing is we have information from the generation 0, from the parents of our original men, and now our target sample, our second generation. And of the 1,900 eligible, 1,300 and change have participated with us. And one of the things we're doing is going through and elaborately coding the records of their family lives. So it's been quite a long process. In addition, some of them are coming into our lab, and Mike is actually in charge of this whole thing. We bring them into our lab and we get biomarkers, we draw their blood, we stress them out, and we have them do something called the Trier Social Stress Test, where we ask them to give a speech, impromptu, and then we ask them to subtract 17 from serial 17s from 2000, telling them it's an easy task. And every time they make a mistake, we make them start over. It's incredibly stressful. It's quite an effective method for stressing people out. And what we do while they're doing that is we measure their physiology. We measure heart rate variability. We measure essentially how well people calm down after stress. That's the real object of interest here. And then we measure serum biomarkers for chronic inflammation, for glucose control. We're going to measure their telomeres and DNA methylation, because there's some evidence that genes are turned on and off in specific patterns in chronic stress. And then finally, I'm not going to go through this. This is my stuff about social isolation. So this is essentially Robert Putnam, as you know, is a sociologist who I think is still at the Harvard Kennedy School, who has written a lot about the decline in social engagement in the United States in particular, a huge decline that occurred with the advent of television, and now then 25 years after he did his original survey, another huge decline in social engagement with the advent of electronic screens and the internet. So, all right. So one of the things we are worried about and thinking about is what's happening to social functioning. So I've just told you why social functioning is so important and why connections are so important. So what's happened? What are our screens doing to us? That's the big question I think people are asking, and we know that the answer is incredibly complicated. We just don't know the answer at this point. Both in terms of our current relationships, we also don't know what it's doing for child rearing, but we know that it's having profound effects. And you talk to any parent of young children and they're thinking about this a lot. So our generations 3 and 4, we hope to start studying in these primary research areas. First of all, how are younger people acquiring a sense of life purpose and a sense of motivation? How has all this social change affected women and changing roles for women, in, not just in the workplace, but in social life? The role of electronic media is something actually we're here to discuss later this afternoon, because we're really interested in trying to figure out how this is shaping people's interpersonal functioning, and through that, perhaps their health and their well-being. And to what extent does this change our investment in the community? And what about this issue of social capital and whether we're investing in each other and in community activities and in purposes beyond the self, basically. And what we're hoping to do is not just do it in the US with the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of our people, but the United Arab Emirates is interested in this because they're wondering what's happening to their younger people. As you know, it's a country with tremendous affluence where everything is provided for this younger generation. And I think people are beginning to wonder what that's going to mean for their sense of purpose, social engagement. And also, the country of Bhutan is interested for very different reasons, because they're still an agrarian society that's looking to figure out how to, what's going to happen as all of this technological change sweeps through their society. So I was just there like 3 weeks ago, and one of the most striking images was to be at a Buddhist monastery and see all the monks on their cell phones. Everybody has a smartphone now. So I'm going to end there, and I meant to leave a little more time, but I think we still have just over 10 minutes for comments, questions. Okay. Yeah.
Has there been any kind of feedback based on this analysis to the participants? Like, have you ever told them about their results and what you think is going to happen to them, and whether it had any effect on them?
Yeah. So we do a little bit of feedback, like when we draw their blood and take their blood pressure, we give them their lab results when they come into our lab. Mostly we don't give them a lot of feedback, partly because we want to keep engaging them and we don't want to bias our data collection going forward, if that makes sense. If we learn something about somebody that they need to know, right? If we found out something that was dangerous, we tell them. If their blood pressure is unusually high, we tell them right away. But other than that, and we let them know in advance, this is not you're not going to learn about yourself individually from this. You're going to help us learn about larger groups of people. But even then, you're sort of asking an interesting question, which is like just by the fact that we've observed people, that we are observing people, we change them. So we are not a hands-off research study. We send them newsletters and thank you notes and all kinds of things. So there's this balance between trying to be very hands-off and trying to create a sense of community so people will stay engaged with us. Yeah.
One thing that was a little striking to me was when you were talking about the connection between behavior and aging, the variables you listed were all sort of deep biology, physiology things. But of course, social changes or social relationship changes could affect behavior. So for instance, if you're not engaged with people, maybe you eat more instant dinner things,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Absolutely.
And I could imagine lots of little things like that. It wouldn't necessarily be correlated with telomeres or things like that. You're sort of damaging your body in lots of small ways.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, that's absolutely. I mean, so one example is that they found that when wives died, husbands died pretty shortly thereafter. Many, not all, right? But that and it was no mystery. It was because they stopped taking their medication, they stopped eating properly, and so you're talking about those kinds of behaviors that are.
Behaviors that are hard to observe.
Yeah.
Because each one may be small,
Yeah.
but cumulative effect would be quite large.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think what you're talking about is that, we have these steps along the way, these mediating steps that lead from A to C to Z. And so I think what we're always trying to do is measure those intermediary steps. So we're measuring biomarkers, but we know that those in some ways are end results of a whole lot of little behaviors. And I think that the challenge is to figure out what the mediating steps are and which ones are most important to measure. And what we try to do is measure the mediating steps where there might be potential for intervention. Because, one of the things we're always having to justify is, well, so what? So we find out that these are the pathways. What difference does that make? And so that's what we do. We try to present.
Would you mention things like habit regularity,
Yeah.
strength like that? 'Cause
Absolutely.
Those are ones that I would expect that you would be able to see a lot of this behavioral change.
Yeah, we measure, we ask people about sleep, we ask people about diet, exercise, yeah, a lot of that. Diet, exercise, smoking, alcohol use, what else?
All different kinds of emotional processes. We do some formal kind of symptom scales of like anxiety and depression. We ask them about their attitudes about
Do you do a
aging.
quality of life scale?
Yes.
We do. So yeah, we have a lot of measures.
Yeah, too many measures.
You have to ask well thought out questions to approach it, but it's a good point. There's a lot of things in those kind of deep biology measures that kind of might lead up to that. So we're hoping our sample size will help support us looking at a number of these measures together to find out what matters.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think we can project the research about the generation of our grandparents on our generation, in the sense of, for the married grandparents, it made their life longer and happier. Do you think that if we are married, we're going to be happier and live longer?
Yeah. It's such an important question. We're always trying to figure out, like with every paper we write, one of the limitations in our limitations section is this is a unique historical cohort, and we don't know the extent to which these findings are generalizable to other historical cohorts. So you're absolutely right. Some of what I presented includes results that are for other groups, right? Other historical cohorts. Certainly, a lot of the results include studies of women. So I try not to present results that haven't been corroborated by other research groups for that reason. But it's really key. When you do longitudinal research, you've just got this one cohort that you're following, and that's very peculiar.
If there's some ground truth that would also be applicable to any generation?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's what we're hoping to find, but for that we need a lot of studies that all pointing in the same direction. So studies of different generations that keep pointing in the same direction. Like no one study, as you know, right, as scientists, you don't want to believe any one study most of the time, right? Very few studies are definitive. This one certainly isn't. Yeah.
Did you find any underlying trends of how people were able to have good social connections?
Oh yeah. Well, that's a really good question. Like, what what makes for good, what sets you up to have good social connections? One of the things that seems pretty clear is that having a warm, stable childhood makes a huge difference. Now, that's not uniformly the case, but people who have essentially been in stable, loving connections with at least one adult are more likely to have better relationships. So we actually just published a paper in which we found that people who had warmer childhoods had a more secure relationship with their spouse 60 years later. But that's just, again, that's just one study. But I think as a general trend, childhood experience is huge. I mean, it's sort of why, you know, if I ruled the world and I could decide where to invest a huge chunk of our resources, it would be in age 0 to 4, and supporting the people who take care of those kids, because the ramifications are just enormous. Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit on how you can be sure that the testing methodology itself doesn't influence behavior? If people are being assessed every 2 years with questionnaires and interviews,
Yeah.
it must affect them somehow.
It does, and we even asked them in one of the recent questionnaires, how has this affected you? And of course, some people said, you know, it doesn't affect me at all, or it's just a nuisance, and some people said it's really important. I mean, there are lie scales in some of our measures, you know, social desirability, where we try to figure out what are people saying just because it's the socially desirable answer. The bottom line is we really don't know how we affect. We know we do affect things, and we know, for example, some people have said, your questionnaires have gotten me to reflect on my life every 2 years. I mean, many people don't do that. So to be honest, we just don't have any way of knowing. It's another reason why you wouldn't want to believe anything from our study alone, but you would want our study to be one piece of evidence pointing to a particular finding. Yeah.
You showed a graph of the married couples and the children arriving, moving, and moving back out again, or whatever. Is there a similar graph for people when they get to retirement age and they retire or don't retire?
No, there isn't, but so my predecessor, George Valiant, was particularly interested in retirement, and he found and this was just among the Harvard men, so they're an idiosyncratic group, but he found that to his surprise, that the people who were most busy and active and workaholics, if you will, at age 60, were among the happiest in retirement at age 75. That it wasn't the case that if you just work furiously that you're not going to be happy retiring. That there was quite a lot of individual variability, right? But there were certain things that predicted happiness in retirement. One of them was replacing your workmates with other social contexts. Because especially, and this was men, like women know, it's a generalization, but I think women know much more than men the importance of the connections they have day to day. Men would be like blindsided. They'd leave their workplaces where they had lots of casual social contact every day. They'd go home and there'd be nobody there, and they'd be like, what happened? And so the men who were more content in retirement were the men who paid attention to that and did things about it to have more social connection. Yeah.
Did you consider that some people are completely independent of what happens to them, much more content than others?
Yes. We know that temperamentally people just are born different, right? And they absolutely. I don't think we've done a particularly good job studying that or accounting for it. I think people have had a hard time operationalizing and quantifying temperament, but it's very real. I don't think we're not the ones who've done that work. But it's you're making a really important point. Patty, you were going to ask.
Have you thought about opening up the database for others to work?
Yeah, we would love, actually, if people want to work with our data, we would love to have you come and collaborate with us. We do have people come all the time. What we're committed to doing, because we're funded by NIH, so we're committed at a certain point to putting all these data online, you know, in de-identified form. But we would love to have collaborators, because people come from different areas and they look at stuff we would never look at. So, like, I have a resident who's interested in children and brains, and she discovered that they had asked systematically about whether people had concussions when they came into the study, and really good questions about concussions. And we have so much data on what happened to people who had concussions throughout their lives in all these domains. It's just one example of why having people from, you know, with different interests has been a huge benefit. And we have more data than we're ever going to be able to write from. So. Yeah.
Okay, it might be a little bit creepy, but I'm just wondering, is that possible for us to like build a model about like the when the health or the happiness, like linear or non-linear combination of all the possible factors in our life? Have you ever tried to do that, to build a model of?
To build a model that incorporates all those.
Yeah, so it's going to be like we are labeled with, oh, we should have a good relationship when we are a child, we should do something, we should do something. Then we will have a kind of...
Yeah.
Is there any like work towards building such a model?
Wow. It's really hard to do. Like, actually, you sound like my son is just finishing a PhD here in economics, and they build models like this all the time with like, but they have data sets with, you know, tens of thousands of points. But I think one of the difficulties of building a model is that we're still working with a relatively small sample. And so our statistical power, you know, as you know, the more variables you include in a model, the more power you need in order to reliably find results that are actually there. And so what we'd really like to do is throw everything in at once, but we don't have enough. So what we do is we try to have very theoretically driven questions and focused questions. The other problem with this kind of study is you can, actually one reviewer for the New England Journal of Medicine called it the biggest fishing expedition of all time. And it was not a flattering view, as you know. But so what we do, because we do have to be, we are in danger of fishing, you know, of throwing everything into a model and just seeing what emerges. But of course, serendipitous findings are then really likely. They're almost certain. So what we're always trying to do is be pretty theoretically and empirically driven in the questions we ask and the models that we test. But I wish we could do what you're talking about. Yeah.
I'm curious if you found any interesting results between the two different groups, the boys versus the Harvard grads.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, so some things won't surprise you. The inner city men died on average 10 years earlier than the Harvard men. And probably that had probably had some to do with terrible childhood adversity that the inner city men faced. But also that the Harvard men took better care of themselves. They had better access to health care. And they got the message, a lot of messages were coming out in the 60s and 70s about the dangers of smoking, the dangers of alcoholism, and the need for exercise. And I think some of the more educated people got those messages sooner. I think those messages have now spread much more broadly in the culture, but those are some of the reasons. In terms of other things, what we found, actually, one of the most interesting things is that among these 1,300 children, the median household income is something around $100,000, and it's not that different for the descendants of the inner city men as it is for the descendants of the Harvard men. So there was a lot of coming together of equalization. One reason for that probably is that the inner city guys were all white, because people of color couldn't get loans, they couldn't buy homes in decent neighborhoods with good school systems. So there was a lot of room for upward mobility among the inner city men, probably because they were Caucasian. There's so many questions. Are we okay? Do you guys want to stay long? How do you want to do this?
Let's just take a few more questions
Okay.
and then we have another
Yeah.
meeting planned.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
From, I guess, I'm not sure if this is something that you have measured throughout the study, but we talked about how people who had better childhoods tended to fare better in their later life. Did you find exceptions to that rule? And if so, were there commonalities among like the traits of those people or something redeeming or some sort of resilience that they were able to exhibit that others weren't?
Yeah. I mean, you're asking the questions that interest me the most. So like I'm a psychoanalyst, right? And so I'm really interested in like, I'm interested in individual differences and what allows some kids to thrive even though they've had horrible experiences earlier in life, and how come some people who seem to have all the advantages just can't survive and fall apart. I don't think we've really approached your question. I mean, there's some obvious things, people who fall into alcoholism, that's a huge factor. But what sets some people up to be resilient and what sets some people up to fall apart even despite advantages, I don't think we've studied that very well. Yeah.
I was just wondering, did you ever look at the differences in birth order with the men from the two cohorts, or are they single children? Like, are they the eldest, middle child, that sort of thing?
Well, a couple of our students looked at that, and we were all excited because there was somebody from MIT did a big thing on birth order, didn't he? There was a book. It was a big, and we got all excited and we looked. There was no, birth order didn't determine occupational success. It didn't determine any of that stuff. No, it didn't. We couldn't find, and we actually finally, I had to stop my students from fishing because they said there has to be something there, and we just didn't find anything.
What about numbers of siblings?
Did that
Whether
relate?
there was a one-child family or 5?
No, it didn't. It didn't. And because I used to have the idea that if you came from a family with a lot more siblings, you were more deprived, basically. There would be more difficulty. And one of my colleagues who came from a great big Irish Catholic family said, that's a complete bias that's not borne out, that a lot of times people in bigger families there are more resources, that older siblings are there for younger siblings. There are a lot of, my preconceptions coming from a 2-child family myself was that, that was some sort of ideal. So anyway, bottom line is we didn't find anything. But again, we were only dealing with 724 families at that time. So again, it's a small sample.
In a non-white population, it will matter more probably, right?
Yeah. So what do you know about that?
Well, I mean, it's just that the resources, the way you just interpreted the resources for a white family is different. So more children doesn't necessarily mean more wealth or more resources.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be really. I bet there's a lot of stuff written about that, right? And studied. Yeah.
Given you're doing this in some sense again, or you're expanding the theme, what are the most important things that you wish you had, or your predecessors had done, that you, for these future sites, will do?
Like, oh boy, now we've got it all figured out and we're going to do it right. I'm teasing. I'm teasing.
About doing these better?
I bet. Okay, so like it makes you really humble, right? Like what you think. Like, so we think we know what to measure now, and I think if we're lucky and this study is going 20 years from now or 50 years from now, they're going to look back and say, oh God, why'd they do it this way? I think that's what we're always up against. But that said, what I wish is that there had been more repeated measures. So where they had literally asked the same question over time, because then you can look at trajectories of social functioning, trajectories of blood pressure, if you do exactly the same measure over time. So that, I think, is the thing that we would like to do more of if we can.
One last one. Can you answer this question? He's got his hands up.
Oh.
Have you been? Have you?
Because I've seen yours go up.
You're yielding the floor.
I'm
You're
yielding
yielding.
the floor to the one
Well,
outside.
thank you very much. So okay.
Yeah.
Like in a slide you mentioned that like loneliness is toxic.
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested why like it's what is
Why is
the,
that?
Yeah, why is that? What is the mechanism?
We think that loneliness is essentially a stressor, right? That it's like other kinds of adversity, that it sets up a chronic. It leads to depression, anxiety. One theory is that we're pretty social animals and that we need that connection in order to have a sense of well-being, so that it sets up those biological reactions that I was talking about. What?
Yeah, but for the example you just gave at the beginning of your talk, like I think it's like being alone in that kind of situation is kind of like important to be like avoiding like being flooded by like, everybody's happy. I'm just like,
Oh yeah. Okay.
So-
You're talking about the difference between being alone and loneliness, right?
yeah, and also like the conclusion of loneliness is toxic. I think it's really like a dangerous like conclusion for me. For example, like I think for people like for example monks, I'm not sure they're
okay.
definitely like alone maybe like in a sense than like social people, but maybe they are happier.
Well, let me make a distinction, because you're right. It's really important that you're pointing this out, right? So loneliness is different from being alone. So people, you can be perfectly content as a monk on a mountaintop. In fact, in Bhutan, if you're a monk, you go meditate for 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days, all by yourself. You don't see anybody. That's not a problem. These are people who sign up for it, want to do it, right? So being alone is different from loneliness. Loneliness is the sense that I want something I don't have with connection. Does that make sense? So it's a sense of lacking. Whereas, and that's the other thing, is that many of us, we're all arrayed on a continuum between introversion and extroversion. Introverts need a lot of alone time, and it's good for them, right? That's not a problem. That's not a stressor. In fact, too much time with other people can be a stressor for introverts. So again, what we're talking about is the sense of lack that's inherent in the definition of loneliness, not being alone per se. Does that?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. We should stop, right? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.